A new round of peace talks underway in the Kazakh capital of Astana gets off to a rocky start. So far, a delegation of rebel groups is refusing to hold direct talks with representatives of the Syrian government. The meeting in Astana was organized by Russia and Turkey with the goal of strengthening a shaky ceasefire across Syria. We begin our coverage with CGTN's Natalie Carney in Astana. Natalie, the talks were supposed to be the first face-to-face meeting between Syrian and rebel factions and government representatives, but we've learned they're talking through intermediaries. What happened?
Yeah, it's shocking, quite frankly, due to the fact that there was a lot of anticipation that these would be the very first time that the rebel fighters did sit down with government officials to try to thrash things out. But yes, as you've mentioned, after the opening speeches, when both sides were sitting in the same room, the opposition delegation decided not to sit face-to-face with the government forces, instead choosing to speak through mediators and facilitators. In part, this was due to what the opposition party says, as the government's continued bombardment of an area just outside of Damascus. Now, this 3-week ceasefire that has relatively held was meant to sort of pave the way to these talks, but unfortunately, both sides continue to accuse the other of violating that ceasefire. So that's the background of how we went into these talks. And as you've mentioned, there's just been sort of disagreements and tense words ever since.
Right, and one other thing, Natalie, not all of the opposition groups are at these talks. What will that mean for the peace process?
Well, that really is the biggest challenge going not only into these talks, but any talks surrounding the Syrian crisis, is that there's just so many actors involved that even if we do see a miraculous breakthrough, you still need to convince the other parties that were not part of the negotiations to jump on board. The terrorist organization ISIL, as well as al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and the PYD, the People's Democratic Union's Party, the Kurdish fighting militia in northern Syria, were not invited to these talks. But, you know, whether you like them or not, they still do change things on the ground in Syria. A leaked draft communique from these talks on day one called for joint action against terrorist groups in Turkey. But both sides differentiate in what they deem a terrorist organization. As well, according to the government, some Syrian groups, considered moderate Syrian fighting groups, reportedly do work rather closely with some of the extremist groups to try to build up their fighting power and their fighting resources. So it's very difficult to vet that. So all of that combined, I mean, it's very difficult. Again, even if we see a miraculous breakthrough, there's still a lot of work to be done to convince everybody involved in this crisis to jump on board.
Okay, Natalie, let's look at the Turkish position. Turkey appears to have softened its tone, no longer insisting that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad must step down. So let's listen to what the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Simsek had to say about this when he addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos.
The suffering of Syrian people and the tragedies, clearly, you know, the blame is squarely on Assad. But we have to be pragmatic, realistic. You know, the facts on the ground have changed dramatically. And so Turkey can no longer insist on, you know, a settlement without Assad, and it's not, you know, realistic.
So what has been the response to Turkey's position in Astana?
Well, there certainly is a different change of tone from what Turkey's been trumpeting for the last 5 years. But to be honest, it hasn't really affected the dynamics of the talks all that much. For one, there's a lot of focus on keeping this a Syrian solution, a Syrian discussion. So while Russia, Turkey, and Iran are mediating the talks, they really want to focus on the communication being between, mind you, through facilitators, being between the opposition and government forces. As well, both sides, the opposition and the government, have said that they will not be discussing any political transition at these talks. These talks will be solely focused on consolidating the ceasefire that they have at the moment in Syria. The opposition has said that there's no context in these talks in which to discuss Assad's future. And during the first day of talks here in Astana, the the lead negotiator for the opposition parties, Mohammed Ali, emphasized their position that Bashar al-Assad must step down before they even begin to discuss any potential political transition. So that doesn't seem like it's going to have much of an effect, at least in Turkey's influence on the opposition. Where it is likely to play a powerful role is Turkey's relationship with Russia. It's likely to bring those two parties even closer together and allow them a little bit more room to negotiate and compromise.
Thanks, Natalie. That's CGTN's Natalie Carney reporting from Astana in Kazakhstan. Joining us now from Damascus is Mohamad Ali. He's a Syrian journalist who's covered the war and politics in the region since 2005. Also with us is Mohammed Ghanem. He is a senior political advisor and government relations director with the Syrian American Council here in Washington, D.C. From London, we're joined by Alexander Nekrassov. He has served as an advisor to the Kremlin and was an investigative journalist with the TASS news agency. Aykan Erdemir is a former member of the Turkish parliament and currently a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let me start with Mohamad Ali in Damascus. These are the first talks that are being held since the fall of Aleppo to the government. But as we heard from our correspondent, the two sides are still very far apart on some very key issues like the status of President Bashar al-Assad. What is the feeling in Damascus on these talks?
Well, regarding the talks happening in Astana, of course, those are very important talks for actually on the way to end the crisis in Syria. But this is just a first step in that direction. I believe that such talks are much more important than political ones because at the end of the day, ending terrorism and separating terrorist groups from other armed groups that are willing to engage in a political solution is the most important point. And of course, this conference happening in Astana is a very important one for actually reaching that kind of a step. Now, what we know is that President Bashar al-Assad said just about 4 days ago in an interview with a Japanese TV channel regarding that conference is that he believes that this conference will allow meetings between the government and militant groups over there in Astana. And of course, those meetings should lead to a kind of a reconciliation, and that those armed men should surrender at least their arms in order to reach a solution and fight terrorism on the ground. Al-Ja'fari, head of the Syrian government's delegation, said that this conference aims to strengthen a ceasefire deal all across the country in all areas except for the areas where ISIL and al-Nusra are present, and also separate those terrorist groups from other militant groups who are willing to work with the Syrian army in fighting terrorism. This is the main issue and the main, perhaps, goal behind such meetings. Okay. And of course, over here in Damascus, if you ask the Syrians on the street, yes, they are hoping for any kind of a solution that would end the crisis and bloodshed.
Okay, Mohammed Ghanem, the point of these talks, as we've been told, is to strengthen that ceasefire. How different are these talks from the ones that took place in Geneva, the ones that were sponsored by the United Nations?
So, of course, we welcome all efforts for a peaceful settlement to the crisis in Syria. The opposition does have a specific agenda. The opposition did not go to Astana to negotiate, political issues right now. The opposition delegation is mainly made up of representatives of the armed groups, and they're there to salvage the ceasefire due to daily violations by the Assad regime. The Assad regime, as we speak now, is shelling a pocket of resistance in Damascus called Wadi Barada, and it's actually the main water source of Damascus. The shelling has done extensive damage to the water aquifer. And so that's why millions of people in Damascus right now don't have access to water. So the opposition this morning gave a presser, and they said, we're here to discuss salvaging the ceasefire. We would like to work on the ceasefire, and we would like to lay the groundwork for talks next month in February, hopefully, in Geneva. So that's the agenda. But as you heard from the gentleman in Damascus, the Assad regime, thinks, or they're interested in let's get these people, maybe these people will surrender and they will lay down their arms and then we will get along and we will fight extremism and fight terrorism, which is the mantra of that's the way the Assad regime describes all political and armed and civilian opposition groups in the country. So we don't have high hopes for these talks. However, again, we welcome, we embrace all all efforts to achieve political
settlement. When you say you don't have high hopes for these talks, just to be clear here, these talks, as far as you are concerned, are about a ceasefire and humanitarian access. So they are not discussing political issues.
The armed opposition, the opposition delegation in Astana right now is made up of representatives from armed groups. And armed groups don't, their job is not to discuss the political issues. The political issues will be discussed by political opposition next month in Geneva. We're there to work on shoring up and salvaging the ceasefire because the Assad regime, just over the past 72 hours, has shelled in Homs, although there's supposed to be a ceasefire on the ground. Civilians are supposed to be protected. They shelled Homs, Daraa, and Wadi Barada. This is unacceptable. That's why we went to Astana.
Okay, Aykan, let's talk about Turkey's role in this. As we've been discussing with our correspondent, there's been one big change. Turkey is now not totally opposed to the idea of Bashar al-Assad remaining in power, having some kind of role in the future in Syria. How much of a game changer is that?
I think Turkey is going through a major change, major revision of its foreign policy. Just a few days ago, Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Şimşek, in his Davos address, for the first time pronounced that Turkey is now thinking of a solution with Assad. And now the Astana talks, I think, are also a radical change vis-à-vis Turkey, because we have to remember that just a few years ago, Turkey was fighting a proxy war against Iran and Russia in Syria, and now we see Turkey at the same table with Iran and Russia. I guess this is Turkey in a more pragmatic mode, Turkey coming to terms with the new reality on the ground. Yes, Astana talks, as my colleague here said, cannot deliver political solution, and Turkey does not expect an immediate political solution.
But I mean, the other thing for Turkey is that this war that has been going on in Syria has had an impact on security in Turkey, hasn't it?
Exactly. I think that's part of the reason why Turkey has had a change of heart over the years, because the conflict in Syria is now having horrible repercussions for Turkey's own security condition. For example, we've had repeated attacks by the Islamic State in Turkey. We've seen Turkey's borders used by various radical groups.
Right.
I think that's the reality that's sinking in, meaning Turkey was so strongly behind regime change in Syria.
Right.
In 2011, in 2012, we have seen a very proactive Turkey pushing for that regime change. But at this point, I think the reality on the one hand of the Islamist violence in Turkey, and on the other hand, the changing situation of the Kurdish cantons or the enclaves in northern Syria have forced Turkey to change its course to a more pragmatic approach vis-à-vis Russia and Iran.
Okay, let's bring in Alexander in London. And Alexander, Russia has been playing a major role in this conflict in Syria. You know, that role has been military, diplomatic, political. In fact, there was a prominent Middle East analyst at the University of Denver here in the United States who told the Al Jazeera television network that with the fall of Aleppo, Russia is now fully in charge. How much leverage does Russia have in these talks taking place in Astana?
Well, I think Russia has quite serious leverage because, first of all, I don't agree with the point that because the leaders of the armed groups are meeting the government in Astana, that means that they're discussing purely military issues. No, it's not the case. The moment you have military leaders of the fighters meeting the government, it's already a political breakthrough. Because only recently, only last year, those same rebels, those same military commanders were not even accepting the government of President Assad. So I think this is a major political shift. Of course, they are not supposed to produce any political solution. That's clear. But this is a step in the right direction. This is a step towards the political resolution. And I think it's a very, very important, I would call it breakthrough, actually. And I think that Russia played a major role in this achievement. And for anyone to say, oh, it's just, you know, a conversation about the ceasefire and humanitarian aid, I don't agree with that. That's a major step towards a political solution.
Okay, let me go to Mohamad Ali in Damascus. Mohamad Ali, what do you make of the Russian involvement in Syria on the one hand, and also to Alexander's point that these talks mark something of a breakthrough as far as the two sides are concerned and what their previous positions have been?
Well, Russia's involvement blocked the way in front of all of those armed groups of having, of course, toppling President Bashar al-Assad and defeating the Syrian government and the army on the ground. What happened after Russia's involvement is that there was a serious fight against terrorism, whether against ISIL, the Al-Nusra Front, or any other group that fights alongside. Of course, Turkey realized that after the Russia's serious involvement, they will not be able, Turkey, with all of the armed groups it supports, they will not be able to topple President Bashar al-Assad. And I believe that this is the number one factor that led Turkey to having negotiations with Russia, that led Turkey to actually speaking with those armed groups on the ground and bringing them to the table of negotiations in Astana. This is the main factor because they have now acknowledged, I believe, Turkey and the other terrorist groups that are supported by Turkey, that they are not able anymore and they have no more chance actually to topple President Bashar al-Assad. So there is no more actually no other option than just going to negotiations over there and trying to find a solution in between over there.
We need to take a break right now. More of our conversation about Syria and the peace talks underway in Astana right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.